It is my very great pleasure to introduce Laura Cirelli today. She is an assistant professor of the University of Toronto in Scarborough. I got to know Laura because I was on her supervisory committee at McMaster, where she got her PhD. And she did groundbreaking research there on music, movement, synchrony, and the induction of empathy in 14-month-old babies. Her first paper on that subject from 2014 already has 349 citations. And she finished her PhD on time. Her oral was more like a conversation among colleagues and a question and answer. It was really fun to be there. And at the same time, she did a large number of studies on the side that weren't part of her PhD thesis. She then did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto Mississauga with Sandra Triup, who's with us today, and then moved on to Scarborough. In the last 6 years, this is since 2014, Google says she's published 24 papers. They have over 1,000 citations. They're in the standard top-notch developmental and music journals, but because of the more wide-ranging implications of work, they're also in publications aimed at a wider audience, like the Annals of New York Academy of Science, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal British Society, and Progress in Brain Research. And currently, at Scarborough, she runs what she calls the Tempo Lab: timing, entrainment, music, and perception. And she studies those in infants and children. We really look forward to hearing her talk today. Laura. Laura is going to try an experiment with us. It's one she uses with her classes, and her students like it. She's going to turn on closed captioning. We've had one member of senior college who has requested closed captioning. So we'll try it today, and then we'll ask people what they think and whether they want us to continue with it or not. Laura.
Great, thank you, Daphne. Let me share my slides. And can you see my slides now?
Oh, yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today and for the lovely introduction. I'm really thrilled to be speaking with you all today about my research program in the Tempo Lab, where we explore the social and emotional nature of musical experiences in early life. And I'd like to open this talk on a strong note by showing you this video of 9-month-old Vanessa, who is demonstrating some highly emotional and engaged responses to one of her favorite songs, which is from the TV program Dora the Explorer. So, you know, the moment that an infant starts to do something like this, starts to respond to music in this way, is a really exciting moment, not only for the baby, but also for the parents and family members who get to enjoy watching this. And we find that children begin to engage with music in this way well before they're walking or talking. They also tend to do these things joyfully, as happily demonstrated here by Vanessa. And as a developmental psychologist, these behaviors lead to a lot of big questions, like what perceptual and motor abilities need to be in place for infants to actually engage in music in this way? How early do musical experiences shape a lifetime of musical behaviors? And why do infants even care about music in the first place? To answer this question, why do infants care about music, we have to start by taking a closer look at the types of contexts within which infants usually experience music. And what we see is that babies are usually sharing music with other people. Perhaps their grandparent gently rocks them and hums them a lullaby. Their parent might bounce them along to the beat of a song playing while they wait in line at the grocery store, or their older sibling might sing and dance with them, playing with them with toy instruments. From the beginning, music is social. In my research program, I argue that it is the social and emotional context of musical engagement in early life that makes these interactions so pervasive and powerful. When thinking about the highly social early musical experiences that a baby has, it's an important place to start to look is really at the musical experiences shared between the infant and their caregiver. How do babies respond to their own parent singing, for example? The parent is often considered to be the infant's first musical mentor. Caregivers in almost all cultures around the world report singing to their infants, and even a newborn infant's attention is easily captured by song over other sorts of auditory stimuli. And when we sing to infants, we tend to do so in a really special way. So I'm going to play 2 clips for you now, and I want you to guess which one is being sung to a baby. So here's clip number 1.
Skidamarinky dinky dink, skidamarinky doo.
And here's clip number 2. Oops.
Skidamarinky dinky dink, skidamarinky doo.
So which one was being sung to a baby, number 1 or number 2? And if you have your camera on, you can hold up your hand and say 1 or 2. I'm getting a 2 from Daphne and a few others as well. So with these 2 examples, the second one was being sung to an infant, and the first one was being sung in a way that wasn't directed specifically to an infant. And I played you a very short clip, and just within that very small amount of song, we can hear that the one directed to the baby is highly emotional, and it sounds like she's smiling when she's singing this way. We tend to find that the way that a person sings to a baby just has different rhythmic and prosodic qualities compared to song directed to another adult or to yourself, for example. So, and this is something we really automatically do. So adults do this, even older children do this, and people of all genders naturally adopt this special style of singing when they're interacting with infants. It's similar in some ways to the way that we speak to infants as well, in a special vocal quality compared to when we're speaking with non-infants. So we do this really automatically, and babies love it. Their interest and attention in this type of singing is also likely to reinforce us to continue singing in this way. So it probably creates a feedback loop where we do it, they like it, and we continue to do that because we're getting that response from them. So they're actively shaping the fact that we're continuing to sing this way. It also does an excellent job at keeping babies happy. So for example, in one study out of Montreal, which Sandra had a hand in as well, infants were placed in a high chair while infant-directed song or infant-directed speech played over loudspeakers. And researchers measured how long babies would actually listen before showing signs of distress. Quite amazingly, the infants who were listening to infant-directed song stayed content for an average of 9 minutes, just sitting there listening for 9 minutes, which for a baby is quite impressive. The infants in the speech condition started to cry and showed signs of distress twice as quickly as the babies in that song condition. Oops. But how infants respond to song also depends on the context. It depends on the parent's goal, the child's present mood, and on song features as well. For example, parents may sing soft and slow lullabies to their infants to prepare them to sleep. For example, they might sing Hush Little Baby. They might also sing really playful and rhythmically complex play songs like Itsy Bitsy Spider if they want to play with their awake and alert infant or entertain them during a routine diaper change. They may also use song to try to cheer up their infant when the child is sad. Perhaps the child has an especially well-loved song that parents find works particularly well at distracting babies from distress. So in the first stream of my research program that I'd like to share with you today, I've been exploring how infants respond to parental song in a variety of functional and emotional contexts. The first study that I'll tell you about is from my postdoctoral work with Sandra Trehub. And our question was about this idea of song function. I mentioned that we sometimes use songs to soothe, we sometimes use songs to play. Most infant-directed songs can fall into one of these 2 categories of lullaby or play song. So do infants respond predictably to songs of these different style types? If so, that highlights the functional importance of song, but also highlights that infants' responses to song are likely driven by acoustic features and parent behavior when performing them. So in this study, we had 8 to 11-month-old infants come into the lab and sit in a high chair facing their parent. We were interested in video recording the parent and the infant's behavior, but we were also looked at their physiological responses throughout the procedure. So to look at their physiological responses in this study, we measured what's called skin conductance. Essentially, when we are excited or stressed, our sympathetic nervous system becomes more active. And this actually widens our sweat glands and makes our skin more conductive. So when we relax, that skin conductivity goes down. We can measure this change in skin conductivity using little sensors that we place on adults' fingertips. I know it's kind of tiny, but you can maybe see some stickers on the mom's hand here. And we also can put the same sensors on a baby's sweaty little foot, shown here, bundled up under this sock, to get that measure from them as well. So babies and parents got rigged up with these sensors and set up with all the cameras around them. And then we asked parents to sing the song Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in 2 different ways. We asked them to alternate between singing it in a soothing way and singing it in a playful way. And we would have them repeat this alternation up to 10 times. So I'm going to show you a couple of video examples here of one of the dyads who participated in our study. You'll see the video of the baby on the side here. And we had another camera pointing at the mother's face, which is overlaid in this corner. I know it's a bit small, but that's what's going on over here. On the left, we have the skin conductance responses of the infant shown in this top line and of the mother shown in the bottom line. And these are going to unfold across time as the video progresses. So here's an example of this mom's song when we asked her to sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in a soothing manner.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
All right, and here's the same mother when we asked her to sing in a playful manner.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are.
So in terms of the instructions that we gave parents here, we really just said, sing in a soothing way, sing in a playful way. We didn't give them any hints about how they might achieve that goal. But what this mother did is really what we tended to see generally across the board. You may have noticed that when she was singing in a playful way, she sang at a higher musical key. So she raised the overall pitch of her song. She sang a little bit faster with more rhythmic complexity, and she sang louder. So parents were actually surprisingly consistent in terms of the acoustic strategies that they actually used to make these 2 goals really distinct when using the same exact song. So how did the babies and the parents respond? What we found was that both the infants and the mothers had a decrease in their physiological arousal during the lullaby conditions, whereas their arousal levels stayed stable during the play song conditions. So I'll just walk you through this. There's too many lines on this graph, but here we have the parents' skin conductance levels shown in the solid lines, and the infants are shown in the dashed lines. The 2 blue lines represent the skin conductance levels of the mother here in the solid blue line and the infants here in the dashed lines as the songs unfolded over time. So the x-axis here is time unfolding. And then the y-axis that we're looking at here is the actual skin conductance level changing from baseline. So what we see with the blue lines is that there is this downward trend where as the song unfolds, the babies are becoming more relaxed. They're being soothed by the lullaby, which certainly is the goal. But interestingly, the parent is also experiencing that reduction in arousal as the song unfolds. For the play songs shown in red, we see stable arousal. They remain excited. And in terms of their behavior, we also found that the infant's attention was really captured to the parent in that condition. The infant was more likely to focus their gaze on the parent in that play song condition. So this supports the idea that lullabies are achieving their goal of relaxing the infants, which if you've sung a lullaby to an infant at some point, you're probably not terribly surprised. But it adds this interesting and important point about how this is a shared experience with the parent or the caregiver. Both the infant and the parent are becoming more relaxed as the parent sings a lullaby. This also supports the idea that song function can really influence an infant's response to different song styles, and shows us that infants respond as we might expect when they're already in a good mood, at least. But another song function that I mentioned earlier that parents employ is to use song to cheer up a distressed infant, which we explored in the next study. So in this next study, we asked, can we use song to actually mitigate infant distress? Can we cheer up sad babies by singing to them? And again, we measured infant behavior in a face-to-face interaction between the baby and their own caregiver. We were interested also in exploring whether the song that a parent chooses to sing to the infant when they're sad is actually important here. So specifically, we compared whether the parent used the baby's favorite song to times when the parent just used an unfamiliar song to try to cheer up a baby. And we predicted that song in general might be more effective than speech at cheering up a sad baby, given the attention capturing properties of infant directed song. But we also predicted that familiar songs would be particularly effective. So the general procedure consisted of the following phases. We started with what we called a play phase, where the parents were instructed to just interact playfully with their infant and keep them happy. They had a few toys at their disposal that they could use to achieve this goal. And after 2 minutes of just playing, we asked the parent to put the toys away and actually look off to the left, put on a really neutral expression, and after 5 seconds, look back to the infant holding that neutral expression. This method is known as the still face procedure. It's used quite a lot in developmental research, and babies don't like it. So when mother suddenly becomes an unresponsive robot, babies tend to become distressed and try to bid for her attention and may become upset. So the mothers would hold this neutral, unresponsive face for up to a minute or until the infant showed distress for 10 seconds, and then we would move on to the next part. And this next part is the really pivotal part for this particular research question. This reunion phase is where the mothers could then interact with their child once more to try to cheer them up. So now we just made you make your baby sad, please cheer them up for us. But we had specific instructions about what they could do during this phase in order to make their infant happier. In one of the trials, we would ask the parent to cheer their baby up by speaking to them in a really natural way. In another condition, we asked her to sing the child's favorite song. And in a third condition, we asked her to sing a pre-selected child song that the mother herself was comfortable with, but it wasn't a song that they sung to their infant. And across all of the families who participated in this study, the order of those three conditions was randomized. So what we found did support our hypothesis. Song, whether it was familiar or not, was more effective than speech at cheering up infants, but familiar songs were especially effective. So here I'm plotting one of our behavioral measures, which we called negative affect ratings on the y-axis. And to get this measure, we actually had research assistants watching silent videos of the babies participating in the experiment. They were blind to what phase they were watching and to the condition itself. And they listened without any sound, but they indicated whenever frowning occurred and crying and fussiness, basically. And they also indicated how extreme that was. So higher scores here mean that the baby was frowning and crying more and that those emotional expressions were more extreme. So along x-axis here, we have the different phases of the experiment. So during the play phase itself, as we would expect, the babies were happy. There was no reason for them to be sad here. Parents were just playing with them normally. And once we asked parents to put on that neutral expression, as expected, babies became distressed. That's more of a manipulation check than anything else. But the important question is what happens in terms of their negative affect levels once that reunion phase begins to unfold. I've broken this down here into 30-second chunks. That's just the R1, R2, R3 thing here. So the first 30 seconds of the reunion, the second 30 seconds of the reunion, and so on. So what we find is that when parents talk to their infants to try to cheer them up, shown in the gray line, babies just continue to become more distressed. It doesn't work. It doesn't cheer them up. In fact, they become continually more upset. It's a different story with the familiar and the unfamiliar song. We do see a drop in negative affect, not down to baseline, but it is cheering them up at least to some extent. And we see a more extreme drop in negative affect in that familiar song condition. Both song conditions were also more effective than speech at capturing infant attention, but familiar songs were especially effective. And familiar songs were the only ones that actually generated infant smiling during the reunion phase. So really the take-home point here is just that in general, song was more effective than speech at regulating infant emotions in this context, and familiar songs were especially effective. So in experiment 3, which is some work from the Tempo Lab now, we wanted to explore this idea of song familiarity more closely. What is it about familiar songs that is so effective at capturing infant attention? And would these songs be as effective if they were sung by a complete stranger? In the previous studies, it was always the own caregiver, the infant's parent was always the one who was singing to them. So what if the renditions were also quite different from how mom tends to sing a particular song in terms of pitch and tempo? Do babies still recognize that as a song that they're familiar with? To explore these questions, we played a series of recordings to infants and measured how long each of these recordings captured their attention. We call this procedure head turn preference procedure. And in this procedure, an infant sits on their parent's lap in the lab. I know this video is a little dark, baby's in the lab right now here, but I'll show you in the video, the lights come up a little bit. So the baby sits on the parent's lap, and we first capture their attention to a screen that's flashing right in front of them. Once we have their attention there, we flash a screen that's either on the left or the right to capture their attention off to one side. And once they're looking, we start to play a song to them from a recording. We continue to play that song until they get bored and look away for 2 seconds. And so after repeated trials, we can get measures of how long each recording captured their attention to see if their average listening time is different for certain song categories versus others. So I'll show you what that procedure looks like before I tell you a little bit more about the stimuli that we used. So you'll see the baby sitting on their parent's lap, and then there's an overlay, very tiny overlay in the corner here, which tells you a little bit more about what the baby's seeing, but what they're hearing is actually the most important bit here.
Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Row, row, row your boat. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here is my handle, here is my spout.
All right, so the songs continued to play as long as the baby was actually looking at that screen. And once they got bored and looked away, then the trial stopped. So the songs that they were listening to were, 8 different children's songs that things like Itsy Bitsy Spider and Row, Row, Row Your Boat. And we asked parents to rate how frequently their children heard each of these songs to ensure that the children were presented with some songs that were unfamiliar and some songs that were more familiar. During a previous visit to the lab, we actually collected recordings from the baby's own mother singing these songs. And during the test phase, we played them the recordings of their own mothers singing these songs, as well as a matched recording of a stranger mother singing these songs. So our question was, how do babies respond to songs they know versus don't know, but also is there a difference in how they respond if it's their own mother's singing voice versus a stranger. We know from other research that infants can recognize their own mother's speaking voice, even in utero and especially after birth. So we did predict that they would show some preference for their own mother's singing voice. However, singing also, unlike speaking, really affects the way that it constrains identifying cues, basically, such as idiosyncratic pitch contours, speech rhythms, and so on. So it might be much harder to recognize a person's voice when they're singing compared to when they're speaking. And this was really the first study, to our knowledge, to ask about whether infants can identify or prefer their own mother's singing voice. So what did we find? We found that infants do prefer to listen to familiar songs, but it actually didn't matter if it was mom singing, shown in these two bars, or a stranger singing. We found this robust effect of a preference for the familiar song, and it didn't interact at all with the identity of the singer themselves. So the response, how much they listened to the familiar songs is shown in the purple bars here, and it was quite different than how long they listened to those unfamiliar songs. We thought that perhaps infants would show a stronger preference for their own mother's singing when her rendition actually differed quite greatly from the stranger's in terms of pitch and tempo, but we found no relationship between the differences in these measures and infant listening time. So this suggests that infants are actually really good at recognizing a familiar song, even when the rendition is quite different from what they usually hear. And as one of our friends joked when we told them about these findings, babies seem to like the remix. So they are really good at recognizing that song, even when it's a little bit different from the examples they tend to hear from their parent. We also looked at their behavioral responses aside from just listening time, and found that the babies tended to dance more, or at least move rhythmically more when they were listening to familiar songs. You might have seen some little baby dance moves in the example video there. And we also found reduced skin conductance levels when they were listening to familiar songs. So they were more relaxed and dancing more, regardless, again, of singer identity. So this preference for familiar songs, regardless of singer identity, actually supports the hypothesis that songs are an important cue for shared culture. If a singer of a familiar song is more likely to be like you, then that should have social consequences. And this raises the question, how do infants actually feel about a stranger that they have just met if that person sings a familiar song? Does a familiar song help break the ice, if you will? So in this study with Sandra, we explored this question, do infants prefer singers of familiar songs? And to do this with toddlers, we had 14-month-olds come into the lab, and they would meet a research assistant that they've never met before. And they would, at first, they would just sit on their parents' lap while this person stood in front of them and either sang the song Ants Go Marching, or spoke the lyrics of the song without singing, or as a baseline condition, simply read a book on their own while standing in front of the infant, while the parent actually read a different book to the baby themselves. And we basically wanted to know if the experimenter's behavior during this first point of contact, basically, actually shaped the toddler's social preference for this person. So to measure how they actually felt about this person, we put the toddlers in a situation where they had the opportunity to display helpfulness. So the person that they just saw either singing or speaking rhythmically or just standing there reading a book would now perform a few simple tasks like drawing pictures with markers or pinning dishcloths up on a clothesline. And every now and then she would accidentally drop the objects that she needed to complete the task. So these objects were lying on the floor in front of the infant. And without being specifically requested, we wanted to know if the baby would take it upon themselves to pick those objects up and hand them back to the experimenter as a sign of helpfulness. So over a few different tasks, babies had 9 opportunities to display helpfulness by handing dropped objects back to this person. And here's what that might look like for this little guy doing the marker task with the experimenter. Look at that. I need to keep coloring it. Oopsie. Oh no. Uh-oh. Ah, okay. I'm gonna keep coloring with that pink marker. All right, so that guy handed the marker back. He'd get a point for helpfulness, and all the babies had 9 opportunities to display helpfulness, so we could get a measure that's like the percentage of times that they helped. We found that infants helped more if they were in the singing condition or the speaking condition compared to the baseline condition. The rates of helpfulness didn't differ across these 2 conditions. But we also asked parents afterward how familiar the child was with the song that we selected, which happened to be Ants Go Marching. We found that there was actually quite a range in how familiar children were with this particular song. So when digging a bit deeper, we found that the infants who actually heard the song the most at home, they often heard it, it was part of their repertoire, they were the ones in that condition that helped, in the song condition, that helped the most. Whereas the infants who were unfamiliar with the song or only ever heard it rarely helped much less. So whether or not they actually helped in the song condition was really affected by how familiar they were with the song that this stranger sang to them. So together, these 4 studies about song that I've rushed through here explore, infant responses. They highlight that infants respond differently to songs with different intended functions, that songs can regulate mood and mitigate distress, especially familiar songs, and that familiar songs are particularly powerful at capturing infant attention and even directing social behavior. Song familiarity is not the only cue in a musical interaction that shapes an infant's social judgment about a musical partner, though. So I'm going to move into a discussion about a different line of research, focusing instead on what we call interpersonal synchrony. So some of my early work that Daphne mentioned a little bit in the introduction focuses on synchronous movement with other people. So this is all about moving at the same moment in time as others. If we all clapped together in unison, then we would be moving in synchrony. And musical settings make it really easy to synchronize our movements with other people. It's not the only context where synchronous movement occurs, but it's one where synchrony is easily achieved. You can think about a large group of people, for example, all dancing to the same music at a wedding, or a large choir singing the same song together. Because humans are especially good at clapping along to a beat or moving along to a beat, if we're all listening to the same song and we're all independently moving to that same song, by default, we end up aligning our movements with one another as well. And moving in synchrony with other people has important social consequences. For example, with adults, we find that people who move in sync with each other later feel more socially connected. They'll help and cooperate with one another more, and rate each other as more likable. So we wanted to know if this social preference for a synchronous partner is something that shows up really early in life. So we asked parents to bring their 14-month-old toddlers into the lab to participate in our experiments. And in these studies, an assistant would hold one of our little junior scientists in a forward-facing carrier and gently bounce them to the beat of Twist and Shout, which played in the background for 2 minutes. Meanwhile, the main experimenter would face the baby and bounce in synchrony with half of the infants and bounce out of synchrony with the other half of the infants. So moving either faster or slower than how the infant was being bounced. The babies would then perform helping tasks similar to the one I just showed you a video of, where the experimenter would do simple things like pinning dishcloths up on a clothesline or drawing a picture with markers, and then every now and then accidentally dropping the objects that she was using. And again, we measured how many of these objects infants handed back. So here's a video showing you what that general procedure looked like. All right, so we found that like adults, babies do show a social preference for a synchronous movement partner over an out of sync or asynchronous movement partner. They hand back more dropped objects. They're more willing to help this person. So yeah, if we moved in synchrony with them, they handed back about half of the objects that we dropped, which was significantly more than how many they handed back if we moved out of synchrony with them. And given that moving in sync is really a common part of musical engagement with infants, when we hold them and rock them, for example, these findings suggest that infants do feel socially closer to individuals after musical interactions that encourage high levels of interpersonal synchrony. We did a series of follow-up studies while I was at McMaster with toddlers. We replicated these effects a few times over, and we also were exploring what kinds of social decisions babies are actually making here. Did the synchronous movement make them like their synchronous partner more? Did it make them like their synchronous partner as well as other members of that person's social group? Or did it simply put them into a really good mood, in which case they might help any person more, anyone who wanders along after that synchronous movement experience, whether it was the person involved or not? So what we found was that synchronous movement did encourage the infants to help their synchronous movement partner specifically, but also friends of that synchronous partner. So people who were already previously established to be like members of that person's social group. But it didn't simply elicit general helping towards anyone. So for example, if there was a neutral experimenter who was just reading a book in the corner during the entire bouncing experience, moving synchronously with the main experimenter wouldn't make them help the neutral experimenter more. So synchrony makes us like our synchronous partners and members of that person's social group, but it's still a specific increase in helping that's not generalized to just anybody who wanders along. There's something about that person that you're moving with. Given that synchrony with one person may affect how a child feels about members of that person's social group, in a more recent study, we explored whether moving together can actually mitigate the other race bias that we see in children. So I ran this study with collaborators in China with 6-year-old children, and these children were from neighborhoods with very little racial diversity. Children living here were unlikely to ever interact with non-Chinese people. And previous work has shown that children in racially homogenous places like this tend to have both implicit and explicit own race biases. They're more likely, for example, to associate smiling faces with pictures of people from their own race. And they're also more likely to explicitly select an own race adult to be a hypothetical summer camp counselor or swim instructor, for example. So these pro-own race biases come hand in hand with anti-other race biases. And so many researchers are exploring ways to mitigate early racial bias in early childhood. So here we wanted to know if moving synchronously could affect not only how a child feels about the person they're moving with, but also how they feel more generally about people, other members of that person's racial group. So in this experiment, children would sit across from an experimenter and they would play a short musical game with them where they had to clap and tap along to the beat of music that they heard over their headphones. And the experimenter that they moved with was either an own race Chinese female or an other race Black female. For half of these children, the experimenter and the child listened to the same musical track with the same tempo. So their movements when they were clapping and tapping were synchronized with one another. For the other half of these children, the child and the experimenter were actually listening to two different musical tracks so that were at different tempos, so their movements were out of synchrony with each other. So here's what this would look like for a child who was in the other race experimenter synchrony condition. And this little musical game lasted for a couple of minutes. And before and after the musical game, we had children complete tasks to calculate how much they liked this particular experimenter and also how much explicit bias they showed for their own race group and for other race groups. What we found replicating what we see with toddlers and with adults as well, is that the children in the synchrony conditions in general liked their synchronous partner more after playing this musical game with them compared to children in the out of synchrony condition, regardless of the race of the experimenter. So whether they were clapping and tapping with an own race Chinese experimenter or an other race Black experimenter, they liked this person more if they moved in synchrony with them than if they moved out of synchrony with them. In terms of their explicit racial bias, so like how willing are they to ask for either a Chinese or a Black swim instructor in a hypothetical scenario, we found that the children who moved in synchrony with their own race Chinese experimenter actually showed exaggerated pro-own race bias afterward compared to the children who moved out of synchrony with the own race Chinese experimenter. So if they're moving with an own race experimenter, synchrony actually made them like not only that person more, but also Chinese people in general more compared to if they moved out of sync. So what happened when they moved either in or out of sync with an other race Black experimenter? What we actually found was that all the children who moved with an other race experimenter, whether they moved in sync or out of sync, actually showed reduced anti-Black bias after playing this musical game with the Black experimenter. So we were a little bit surprised that it wasn't like specific to the synchrony condition, but in general, interacting musically with this one Black person made them less likely to feel negatively about Black people in general. We wanted to make sure that this was related to some component of the interaction itself. So we ran a control condition where children just sat at the table coloring a picture while the Black experimenter colored their own independent picture. And in that condition, we found no changes in children's anti-Black racial biases pre and post test. So it wasn't just that they were in the presence of somebody who didn't look like them, it was that they were actually interacting in a more direct way with that person. So yeah, together these findings highlight that moving in synchrony with others makes us like that specific movement partner more, regardless of race, and also that musical interaction in general, whether in sync or out of sync with an other race person, might actually improve cross-group relations. In a new study that we're launching this fall, we're asking 7-year-old children to make judgments about whether third-party characters are likely to be friends or not. And exploring whether children use synchronous movements and race in combination to make those judgments. Research in our lab recently has shown that children of this age do expect two people who move in sync to be more likely to be friends with each other than people who move out of sync. And work from other labs suggests that children use race when making assumptions like this as well. They assume that two people who are from the same racial group are more likely to be friends than people from opposing racial groups. But what do children do when these two cues are both presented to them, sometimes in a compounded way or sometimes in a contradictory way? So here children will be watching videos where they see a target character moving in sync with one child. So the target character in the middle will move in sync with one of these children and out of sync with the other. And we'll be randomizing whether the synchronous child is from the same racial group as the target character, or if they're from a different racial group. And children will then be asked whether they think that this child is better friends with this character or that character. So here's what one of those little trials looks like. And the results from this study will help us understand how children both use both synchrony and racial cues to guide their social expectations. All right, so shifting gears one last time, we were just talking about how infants and young children use movements with other people to guide their social behaviors. And, for a while, most infants are experiencing synchrony with others in musical contexts, mostly when they're being passively moved by a caregiver. They do eventually start to move to music on their own. At first, they're not very good at it. So they do it, but they're not necessarily moving in synchrony with music. It takes quite a while for them to actually be able to align their movements synchronously and to align them properly to the beat of music. But even well before that, they do start to show behaviors like the little baby in this video here, which are really musically generated movements. So when did they start to do this? Parents report that between 4 and 14 months, their infants start to move to music, that's a really big age range. But most parents report that this happens by around 8 months of age. And early dance often consists of trunk and arm movements like what you see demonstrated here by baby Audrey. Some studies have also explored what's called tempo flexibility, which is not necessarily being able to synchronize to a beat, but at least moving faster to faster music and slower to slower music, which is the first indicator that we have that infants are aligning or are like thinking about the actual rate of the music when determining the rate of their own movements. In general, studying tempo flexibility is something that researchers have done in a laboratory setting. They ask toddlers and preschoolers to come into the lab, and they usually ask them to like drum on a drum with a drumstick or shake a bell with their hands to an evenly spaced beat. But these contexts might not really reflect what children do in the wild, if you will, when they're freely dancing. And they may be uncomfortable in a laboratory setting to really demonstrate the full range of their movement abilities. So over the last year, we've been collecting a whole bunch of videos from parents recording their children moving in the home to explore what musical movements look like in a more naturalistic setting. So for this methodology, what we do is the experimenter generates a playlist and then sends this playlist to the parent online. So the parent is instructed to play the playlist for the child and at a time that they're comfortable in their own home, and video record the child's response with their smartphone or something like that. The parent then sends us the video, and our research assistants carefully watch these videos and indicate exactly when certain target behaviors occur. So when did the children start to dance and when do they stop dancing? When they are dancing, how quickly are they moving? Are they smiling? And so on. So for one of the studies where we're using this method, we were exploring free dancing behaviors in toddlers and preschoolers between the age of 1 and 4. And we were interested in seeing how they danced in response to songs at various tempos. And we also were interested in how song familiarity came into play here. Will they dance differently if it's their favorite song versus a song they've never heard before? So the playlist that we built for these kids had their favorite song. Everybody got a custom playlist, although there were a lot of Baby Shark playlists. But anyway, that's the new one that all the kids are listening to. And we also played them an unfamiliar genre match song. So if their favorite song was a children's song, they got an unfamiliar children's song as well. If their favorite song was a pop song, they got an unfamiliar pop song. But we also manipulated the tempos of these songs without affecting the pitch at all, so that they heard a slow version of the song at 90 beats per minute, a moderate version at 120 beats per minute, and a fast version at 150 beats per minute. So we just played them a 1-minute clip of each of these ultimately 6 trial types and had the parent video record their response. So here's a few clips from a few different little dancers in the home. The first one here is one of our younger participants dancing to her favorite song. Here's a older toddler dancing to an unfamiliar song. And a preschooler dancing to his favorite. That was one of our most energetic participants, I think. All right, so across tempos and age range, we found that the children did dance more to their favorite song. So whether the song was something they recognized or not really affected their willingness to engage musically with it. So here I have the age of the children on the x-axis, the youngest children to the oldest. And each dot here represents one of our participants. So if the dot is above this dashed line, it means that they danced on average more to their favorite songs, regardless of tempo, compared to the unfamiliar song. And what we see is that there's more dots over the line than below the line. showing us that they are in fact dancing more to the favorite songs. And it doesn't seem to be something that suddenly emerges at a certain age point. It really does seem to be the case that they're dancing more to the favorite songs across this age range. We were also really interested in tempo flexibility. So this again is this idea that like, can they dance faster to faster music or slower to slower music, in which case that's an indicator that they're actually aligning something about the rate of their movements to what they're hearing. So here I have the target tempo of each song. Remember, we have a slow version, a moderate version, and a fast version of each song. And then the child's actual movement tempo is plotted with the circles and the triangles. So these stars here just represent like if they were moving at exactly the expected tempo, they'd be close to the star. So we see that they're pretty close to the target tempo for the slow 90 beats per minute condition. And they are moving faster for the faster songs. They may actually be more accurate for the favorite songs themselves. So they do seem to be moving closer to the target tempos for the favorite songs than for the unfamiliar songs. But regardless of song familiarity, they are moving faster to the faster songs. It'll be a few years yet before they're really able to line up their movements with those tempos, but they're already starting to show the beginnings of that. All right, so this method has really been useful in exploring how free dancing emerges in a naturalistic context, and it shows us not only is dancing something that's emerging quite early, but it's also flexible. They're moving differently depending on the song that they're listening to. And these early musical movements, given what we know about the effects of moving with other people, are really going to provide a foundation for them to be engaging musically with others. So from listening to their parents softly singing to them to later getting up and grooving to their favorite songs, music is often a pervasive part of everyday life for infants and children. And song connects them to their caregiver, regulates their emotions. They use familiar songs to guide their behaviors and their social decisions. They also feel connected to those who they move in synchrony with, helping and liking these people more. The social implications of synchrony might also have important implications for connecting people across group divides. The social emotional importance of active musical engagement in early life raises questions about when children start to move to music. And we see that even tiny infants and toddlers are moving joyfully to music and paying attention to musical features like tempo to guide those movements. Again, favorite songs have a special power to get children moving and engaged with music. This sets the stage really for a lifetime of social emotional implications for music. As adults, we use the emotional properties of music to help regulate our own emotions or to take ourselves back in time to emotionally powerful memories. We consider our musical preferences to be an important part of our social identity, and sharing music with others connects us. More and more research highlights that moving and singing with other people in musical contexts makes us feel bonded to our musical partners and more willing to cooperate with them. So with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators and colleagues, as well as the research assistants who've watched hours and hours of footage of cute dancing babies, as well as all of the junior scientists, of course, and their families and the funding bodies that made this work possible. And I'm happy to move to the discussion and question period now. Thank you all for your attention.